The Trudeau government is under growing fire after yesterday's revelation that the Prime Minister's mother and brother received payments for the We charity for speaking engagements. The same charity the government selected to run a $900 million program. The Conservatives are calling for a police investigation of the Prime Minister. They say this is, quote, much more serious than just a conflict of interest. Do they have a point? Is a criminal investigation warranted? To dig further into this issue, I'm joined now by Kenneth Jull. He is a lawyer at Gardner Roberts and a law professor at the University of Toronto. Welcome back to the show, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start with this section of the criminal code that the Conservatives have been citing, Section 121. What can you tell me about the criminal offences listed under that section?
121 is commonly called the fraud on the government section. And what it does or deals with is payments to officials, government officials, or members of their family of rewards or benefits. But here's the key: in order or as consideration for them to exercise their influence. And that's the key to the section.
Right. So it's almost like a bribe? Would that be?
It is. It's a domestic bribe. And that's exactly, David, you've got it. That's what it is.
So that was the main one the Conservatives referenced. I think Section 122 was also mentioned, not to get too mathy and criminal codey, but how would that section apply broadly?
So 122 is more aligned with a breach of public duty. But the key really to understand that it's a fraud or breach of duty, but the key there is, again, the concept is an element of corruption. And what it's been interpreted to involve corruption. And so going back to your point, you're right. It's like a domestic bribe because the essence of bribery is corruption.
Okay, so when we look at what those two sections are, because I was at the news conference this morning where the Conservatives raised this, and my question to them is like, are we really talking about criminal behavior here as opposed to, say, maybe stupid and kind of behavior here? When you look at what we know and those sections of the criminal code, do you see them applying to this controversy?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is look at what the cases have said. There was a case called Carson in 2018, which went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And that was a case where Mr. Carson was a former advisor to the Prime Minister's office, not this Prime Minister. And he, in fact, was convicted. And in that case, it was shown that he had arranged for commissions to be paid to his girlfriend in order to help influence contracts payable to a company that he was retained by. And so certainly this is a section that's been interpreted widely. Mm-hmm. Now, the question here is, the real question is there an element of the consideration for influence? And if I could map out maybe arguments for and against the application of this section. So in favor of application of this section, one could argue, or a prosecutor would argue potentially, that we paid these amounts to Mr. Trudeau's mother and his brother, and they were disguised payments. They weren't really legitimate payments. They were disguised payments in order to convince his family to exercise some influence and ultimately push the government to grant we the contract for $19.5 million. The argument on the other side, the defense would be to say, look, this is an objective decision. It was made by civil servants. It was transparent to the extent that the payments were not cash in envelopes. They were, I would assume, taxable. And in that sense, there was nothing covert about it at all. And the defense would say this is simply a public service decision, and there was no influence exercise at all. So those are that's the kind of the battleground.
So I guess the key evidence in determining whether or not this was an objective decision, as the government says it was, would be to see the documentation or the recommendation from the civil service, which the government says was what they acted on, that it was the public servants that said, we are your people, that's who you need to hire here. That would go a long way towards the defense argument, would it not?
Well, first off, I agree with you. I think none of us can make any sort of opinions until we see that kind of documentation. And I think it's premature for anybody to venture an opinion until we see that level of documentation, or at least somebody does sees it.
But in terms of the idea of a criminal act here in some way. I mean, not to carry the government's water for them, because Pablo Rodriguez was explaining things for them, but Margaret Trudeau was paid over a period of 4 years, predating the pandemic. So was the Prime Minister's brother. You'd have to really think that it's quite the long game to pay her and then to benefit from a pandemic response program when no one could anticipate a pandemic was coming, right?
Well, I think that that's a good point. And I think we do have to focus on the aspect of the COVID pandemic. I mean, we're all acting under stress. We're all acting under time stress. And it's important that we have due diligence, obviously, but at the same time, there is a rush to get these things done and to get these procedures in place so that people can benefit from them. So I think your point is an interesting one in terms of the fact that if you look at the timeline, it does go back a long time. These are, as I said, arguably taxable payments. And then we come upon this very short period of time where we're dealing with a real urgency. So those are very good points that would tend to suggest this does not rise to a criminal conduct, because criminal law is a very high bar. Mm-hmm. Whether or not there are ethics issues, that's a different issue for the ethics commissioner to look at.
So just to sum up, a final question. At this point, based on what we know, do you believe there's enough to warrant a police investigation into this matter, as the Conservatives have suggested in their letter to the RCMP?
So I just don't have enough information to form a belief. And I think that's, I know it's a typical lawyer's answer, but I just don't have enough to form a belief one way or the other. I think I would say, in general, as I say, 121 is a very high bar. It deals with a very high level of corruption, and I don't see it from what I've seen, but I would want to reserve judgment until I'd seen actual documentations about what happened at the bureaucracy level and what were the discussions at Cabinet in terms of that bureaucratic decision.
Yeah, you're not alone in wanting more information. I think a lot of people would like that right now. Thank you so much for your insight. Kenneth Jull, lawyer and law professor at the University of Toronto. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
There is sufficient grounds for this matter to be investigated by the police.
When Cabinet was signing off on this decision, was Mr. Trudeau open and forthright with his colleagues? Did he inform them what he was asking them to agree to?
Any discussions that take place in Cabinet, as you're fully aware of, are subject to Cabinet confidentiality.
So the Conservatives want to call in the cops. The Bloc Québécois wants the Prime Minister to step aside while a possible conflict of interest allegation is investigated. The Liberals, well, you heard Minister Navdeep Bains there, are the answers to the questions swirling around this sole source contract to the We charity acceptable? And could this third ethics investigation involving the Prime Minister cost him more than the two previous ones? Questions for the Power Panel. Nigan Sinclair, columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press, is in Winnipeg. In Montreal, Marty Patrickin of The Logic, and Le Devoir's Marie Vastel. Thank you, folks. Marie, I'd like to start with you. I don't know if you heard the interview with Pablo Rodriguez earlier, but you heard Navdeep Bains. They were asked multiple times about what Cabinet knew about the financial connections between the Trudeau family. A simple yes or no, did you know? And they won't give us a clear answer on that, hiding behind Cabinet confidentiality. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that they were told before they approved the decision that there was an apparent conflict and Mr. Trudeau's family members had been paid, and then, yes, Cabinet confidence would apply, but one would think that that should have maybe prompted them to make a different decision on whether this contract should be awarded. I don't think it's ideal that the government has sort of hunkered down after all the latest allegations. Mr. Trudeau was at some point yesterday maybe supposed to have a press conference today that was then canceled. They finally brought Pablo Rodriguez on your show, but I understand you sort of had to push back. It's this old strategy of this government to sort of, when they're in trouble, cut everything, stay radio silent, and sort of wait for it to go away, which in the past has not worked. So I'm surprised they're trying to do this again this time.
Yeah, Nigan, we're kind of seeing that not answering specific questions, a little bit like in the early days of the SNC-Lavalin controversy, where they kind of wanted to figure out what the facts were before they said anything. So what do you make of this level of disclosure to this point?
Well, I mean, it kind of feels like 2005, the Gomery sponsorship scandal all over again. You know, they worked so hard, the Liberals, for so many years to try to move away from that sponsorship scandal. But I mean, the self-imposed implosions of this government kind of are dumbfounding because they continually put themselves in positions, very difficult positions. We can't forget the issues of the Aga Khan with the Prime Minister and various other things that have led to this situation involving, you know, a real self-imposed issue around ethics. And it's not that the Conservative Party doesn't have also issues with ethics too. I mean, Andrew Scheer and the issues around paying for his children's schooling and so on. But it's that the Liberals are just self-imploding in terms of their own issues around ethics. And it goes all the way back to 2005, brings up the same issues going back, 15 years ago.
Marty, what's your take on all of this?
Well, Nigan makes an interesting point. About a week and a half ago, I had a conversation with a couple of Liberals, and one of the things they were most worried about in the current pandemic and the billions and billions of dollars that are going out the door is to have exactly the same situation where, as with the sponsorship scandal in 2005, whereby, like trees in the wind, Liberals somewhere in the country sort of got a hold of some of that money somehow, and that would somehow come out in the press. They were very, very worried about that sort of thing. And it was part of the reason why they sort of want to pivot away from, the payments that they've been making, the sort of payments that they've been making to people to something else, and sort of closing that spigot a little bit. Never in my wildest dreams would I have been able to think that it would have been the Prime Minister himself that implicated the entire party. And to go back to what Marie was saying, the idea, this strategy, this hunkering down and everything like this, I would argue that it's not just the Liberals that do it. The Conservatives did it very, very not so effectively back in the day. And I was just online today looking some of the attack ads that the Liberals had against the Conservatives. And what you see in those patterns was exactly this. Aren't you sick of a government that is opaque, that won't tell you anything, that refuses to answer to any sort of questions when it comes to what it should and shouldn't be doing, ethically challenged and all sorts of things? You could apply those very adjectives that I just used to the Liberal Party today. And again, whether or not this is going to make a difference is another thing to consider. Is it Aga Khan or is it SNC? Is it somewhere in the middle? But suffice to say is that they're pretty good at it.
Marie, go ahead, Marie.
On Marty's point, if I may, on Marty's point, that already Liberals were worried that what is happening would happen. There's a column by our colleague Susan Delacourt in the Toronto Star saying that some MPs are a little bit annoyed, again, that these are self-inflicted wounds. And I've talked to people inside the party as well who are a bit frustrated that, again, like the Aga Khan, like the SNC Lavalin affair, this is a self-inflicted wound. They're in trouble because of their own mistakes. And again, there is a feeling of, how did no one see this coming? How did no one question the optics of giving a contract to an organization that is so close to the Prime Minister, whether it's illegal or not, which was the subject of your previous law with that lawyer, whether he will be blamed by the Ethics Commissioner or not, someone should have told the Prime Minister, or the Prime Minister himself should have thought, maybe this isn't ideal.
Nigan, you wanted to say something?
This is lined up right following the announcement of hundreds of billions of dollars added to the deficit, 300 plus billions of dollars added to the deficit. And I mean, it already looks like a government that's spiraling out of control financially, never mind the fact that they're beginning to pad their own pockets. I was speaking to media today, and, for those of us in the Indigenous community, we're often accused of, pandering to chiefs that let money spiral out and so on. I mean, we've got a situation involving the federal government and the Prime Minister letting not only money spiral out of control, but then is using the money that's available to be able to support organizations that will benefit his own family. I mean, this is what often Indigenous governments are most often regularly accused of. And here we are right at the middle. If this was an Indigenous government, we'd be talking about putting them in third party.
Marty, the Prime Minister hasn't really said anything since a statement last night saying, essentially, I'm not my mother's keeper, I'm not my brother's keeper. They do things independent of this, and this is really about trying to help young people get money for volunteer work to pay for school. He did not speak today or take questions today, even though there are many questions. What does Justin Trudeau need to say next on this?
I think your previous guest hit it right on the head. I think the narrative so far with the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau specifically has been, we were basically instituting what the civil servants were saying. Now, that is a bit of a fig leaf, if you ask me. It's a politician's job to consider the optics of what they're putting into place, particularly when it involves, nearly $1 billion. But I think that fig leaf is very important for them now, because they've said we're just doing what the civil servants are. So we have to see the sort of the machinations and the calculations behind that paperwork about what exactly was put to the civil servants and what exactly the civil servants pushed forward and suggested that the government should do in this case.
Okay, I just want to clarify one point, because we're going to take a quick commercial break. The value of the program was nearly $1 billion. We was not getting $1 billion. They were going to get $19.5 million just for people at home. Because we're throwing around a lot of numbers. It's important. Like $20 million is a lot of money, but it's not $900 million. All right, we're going to talk more about all of this. The 900 and the 20 right after this break. The Power Panel's back for another round. Welcome back to Power and Politics and the Power Panel. Nigan Sinclair, Marie Vastel, and Marty Patrickin. And Nigan, I'd like to start with you. The opposition Conservatives today sent a letter to the Mounties. They're calling for a police investigation. Based on what we've seen so far, does this rise to the level of crime?
Well, I mean, the struggle with this particular, any police involvement is, first is there's issues around cabinet confidentiality, and then the second is the issue around intent. And so the question is whether the Prime Minister intended for this or whether it was civil servants. So both of those are going to be very difficult to prove. So whether it's an issue of criminality or not, I think is going to be stopped by those two issues. And the real issue, I think, though, is that this is the third ethics investigations of this Prime Minister, and it's an ongoing series of self-imposed implosions, per se, as this government continues to hurt itself more than any other party hurts them.
Yeah, Marty, hat tricks are great in hockey, not so great in ethics investigations.
Yeah.
But
it's 3 in 5 years. I mean, he's batting more than 500. That's pretty good.
But do you think this is something that needs the police involved, or can Mario Dion do his job on this?
Again, I don't know if we know enough to formulate an opinion. I think that's part of the sort of the conceit behind what the Conservatives did, to launch out on calling for a police investigation when not all the information is publicly available. That is to say, what exactly the civil servant was told, and what the civil service told the Prime Minister's office isn't known. It's a bit showboating. I take the point that politics is that's the sort of thing you want to do, is to highlight it and drag it on when you're the Conservatives. But police is possibly one step too far at this point. I'm not saying it should be outlawed. I'm saying that it's something you shouldn't consider at all. I'm saying that we don't have enough information to do that. I don't think we certainly don't, and I don't think the Conservatives do. The interesting thing for me to watch is going to be the fact that we are in the midst of a Conservative leadership campaign, which culminates in the end of August. And two of the main, Mr. O'Toole and Peter,
Peter MacKay. Peter MacKay.
Thank you, live TV. Good God. Are raring to go. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry, Peter. Peter MacKay are raring to go on an election, and have talked about that. And I imagine that has something to do with the consideration of what the party's doing right now.
Yeah, I don't think we can go back to an election before kids can go back to school, but maybe that's just me. Maria, I want to know what you think about not the criminal element of this with the RCMP, because I think there's a consensus we don't know enough, but Mr. Blanchette, the Bloc Québécois leader, says Justin Trudeau's got to step down here, hand the keys to Chrystia Freeland, and let her run the government while all of this is being investigated. Marty thinks the Conservatives were overreaching. Is the Bloc overreaching?
Well, I think that's the Bloc's way of not doing what the Conservatives are asking. So essentially, Mr. Blanchette, by saying the Prime Minister should step away while there's an investigation, he essentially said, we can't go in an election in the middle of a pandemic, so let's just take a break and put someone else in charge. I think Peter MacKay and Erin O'Toole can say they want an election, but seeing how they couldn't even campaign for their own leadership, I'm not sure they would actually want to try to campaign in virtual Zoom town halls for a whole election campaign when the actual government is at stake. And as long as the bloc, or at least one party, thinks that it's not a good idea to go into an election during a pandemic, I don't think we're going to see that happen. So I think everyone's sort of trying to ask for something different to make themselves different from their opponents. But I don't think anyone is in a particular rush to go to the polls, given that I don't even think you can do that. As you said, kids don't even go to school. But to the bloc's point, I don't think there's that much pressure on the Prime Minister to step away, but I do think that the accumulation of all these things that are being called for make it so that this is not going to go away for the Prime Minister for a long time. An ethics investigation usually takes 6 to 7 months. That means we'll be talking about this again in the winter whenever there's a report. The simple fact that there is a potential maybe police investigation looming, that stays in the back of people's minds until the RCMP says, no, we're not going to. And in a context of a minority government, when you don't know where there will be an election, once this is potentially over, you don't really want this to come back to the forefront regularly as a reminder to people when you don't know when you're going to go to the polls.
Yeah, and this is where the loss of control of committees is going to be a real challenge for the government. They're not going to be able to adjourn the Justice Committee like they did during SNC, so they're going to have to adapt to that new reality. But Nigan, one thing, there is a difference. You know, the Conservatives want the cops, the Bloc want a resignation. A common thread between the Conservatives and the NDP, at least, is waiving cabinet confidences for full disclosure of documents and information to both the Ethics Commissioner and to the House committees that are going to be investigating this. I couldn't get a clear answer from Pablo Rodriguez on whether or not that's going to happen. So what kind of a message does it send if they don't waive these confidences when we have these allegations that go right into the family tree?
Yeah, it's a very bad look. What it looks like is backroom, shady dealings, history of the Liberal Party, Gomery inquiry. I mean, but, you know, the great amount of attention, I think it's very important to point out that this posturing, this massive sort of over posturing by the three political parties in relation to the federal government are all about, because this is really the first scandal that's been evidently open during the pandemic that a government's generally handled in such a way that it looks very favorable in terms of the world. I mean, the world is kind of falling apart and Canada's holding it together. And so this is an opportunity for the opposition parties to really get favor that they haven't had for months. And so no wonder they're overstepping and they're over promising and overreaching. It's a real sense of a desperation in political parties trying to get on the nightly news.
Yeah, Marty, that is an excellent point. This is the first real opening. I mean, there's been debate back and forth about this program isn't effective, this should be tweaked, that should be changed, but that's sort of the arguing around the edges of things. This goes right to the core.
Yeah, and it goes straight to the core, and it also goes beyond. Look, as someone who lives outside the Ottawa bubble, I can tell you that this story is sticking a lot more than anything else, quote unquote, scandalous with the Liberal government ever since the election. The other thing I'd mention is that, you know, don't forget that we are sitting in this situation. That is to say, an inherently tenuous situation for the Liberal government in a minority position because of their last scandal, because of the SNC Lavalin. The conversations I had with Liberals following the election in October 2019 was very, very similar. What costed the election, and it wasn't blackface. That hardly dented them. Mm-hmm. What hurt them was SNC Lavalin, and that is why we're sitting here, and that is why they're going. I mean, it's almost like a train ride. They're going from one scandal to the next.
Okay, Marie, we're almost out of time, but you want to weigh in with a final thought before we take a break?
Well, I think Marty summed it up well. I mean, again, third time's a charm. We are here again. And as I was saying earlier, this is a minority government. They don't know if they have 3.5 more years ahead of them. They don't know when this is going to end. It's not an ideal time to get yourself in trouble like this. Okay, I want to say thank you to the Power Panel. That was great. Great time, everyone. Nigan Sinclair, Marie Vastel, and Marty Patrick. And thanks so much.
You got
Thanks, guys.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.